Now at this point we're almost done with 3D Max. The last thing, I do my normal and occlusion bakes in XNormal usually because I don't like to work around with cages and stuff. But there's one thing that XNormal can do that I really need for the DDO workflow. That is a diffuse map bake used for materials. Now I converted the low poly back to editable poly mode. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drag, I'm going to first unhide the high poly and hide the low poly because we're going to assign the materials now. And DDO comes with a bunch of preset materials. And what you can do is you can drag the FBX file from the DDO installation folder and import. That will bring a bunch of colored spheres into the scene. Now these spheres all have different materials assigned to them, so use the pipette tool to sample this material. And you can see it's a large list of templates, and they're all color coded. So when you're running this model through DDO, so your textures, it will know which materials to assign to which parts of your texture. So I'm going to just pick off a few materials into empty material slots and use them on my model. So one there. Kind of sort of try to pick materials that will be relevant for the texture. So things like steel, chrome, aluminium, rubber, plastic. These are the sort of things I'm looking for. So metal plates, plastic. Later it's also tweakable in DDO, so it's not a big bother. So I'm going to take my high poly model, just one more material for the top part, because it's not really plastic. So okay. So the main body is painted metal, so I'm going to use this material, steel, for the whole thing. I'm going to select that part and use that material. The top part is going to be like so, and these parts, first you select them completely to make sure the outer edges are the same material as the one underneath it. And then I'm going to select the central parts by using grow to assign some other materials there, like so. Now this is important. This is why I don't just export the diffuse texture of the low poly, is because the low poly does not have this hovering geometry in it, and this is the information I really need to pass on. So I'm going to bake the high poly colors onto the low poly model. So the material assignment is complete at this point. I am ready to bake. I'm going to unhide all the parts. Choose my low poly model and apply a projection modifier to it. Projection modifier will create this blue cage around my model, and what I have to make sure now is to add the high poly to the list. It will show up on the right side, and tweak the cage so that all parts of the high poly fall within the within the cage itself. But you have to be careful not to do too much, because then your textures start warping. So I have to make sure that inside ridge is in, and any bends around the top part are in as well. As I said, you can use this cage perfectly to also render your normal map. and your occlusion map, but I prefer to do it in X normal because it just does it automatically. No need for cages and such, especially for more complex objects. That becomes a headache. So I press 0 on the keyboard to bring up the render to texture dialog. Takes a little bit to load. Make sure the low poly is still selected while you're doing this. Okay, once it's loaded, enable the projection. I do the settings. I set the super sampler max 2.5 star. It's not necessary in this case actually, because this is really for normals and occlusion, but yeah, it's a force of habit, so I'd like to do it anyway. I set the padding to quite a lot of pixels. That's basically the spaces on which it bleeds over the edges of the UV map. I added diffuse map to the list of things to export, and provide a file name for it. Okay, make sure the resolution is high enough, and bake. Shouldn't take long. By the way, still using the what's it called? Still using scanline render, so it goes really fast. See, I toggled the visibility of the high poly, and as you can see, the colors transferred perfectly onto my low poly mesh. Now it is a texture. Especially noticeable by the 2 dots on the top part, which were not present on the low poly. Okay, now we're almost done with Max. Save the file, and what it's left to do is basically export the OBJ files that I'm going to be using in XNormal and DDO. First the low poly. Lost the damn folder. Give it a name. Oh, sorry, that was the 3ds. That's for O2 later, because 3ds saves the smoothing a little better than OBJ. So now OBJ low poly. Save. And important in the settings, just keep an eye on what I'm doing here. All the settings keep them the same. Uncheck normals because DDO will mess up the triangulation. So okay, so we hide the low poly now. Unhide the high poly. Make sure it's also one object, so whatever your model is, make sure it's just one mesh, one editable poly. And do the same thing.